The night was silent, save for the sound of Elias's footsteps as he wandered the lonely hills. His heart had become a hollow echo of its former self, heavy with a loss so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He had once been certain that love could bridge any divide, that it could heal any wound, even one that time could not touch. But standing on the edge of the cave, where the darkness had claimed everything he held dear, Elias realized that some things, some loves, were meant to be lost, not saved. And the hardest part of all? Knowing that the one thing he could never forget was the one thing he could never bring back. In the small village of Mornhill, nestled between the rugged hills, Elias lived in a stone cottage that seemed to grow older with every passing year. Its walls were thick and time-worn, the roof slightly sagging under the weight of memories that had built up like layers of dust. The house, much like its owner, had seen better days. But inside its humble walls a quiet peace had once reigned, at least for Elias and his loyal dog Milo. Milo was not just any dog. He was a large, shaggy creature, his fur a mix of brown and white, with deep, soulful eyes that reflected a heart, far greater than any Elias had known. He had been by Elias's side for as long as the elderly man could remember. The dog followed him wherever he went, and in return, Elias had given him the love of a companion, a friend, and a confidant. Milo was not just a pet. He was family. The bond between them was evident to anyone who saw them together. The way Milo would sit patiently by the hearth as Elias sat in his chair, a cup of tea in his hands, the way the dog would nuzzle his face when he felt the old man's hand fall gently to his fur, or the way Elias would laugh, his voice warm and rich, when Milo tried to catch his hat as it flew off in the wind. There was joy in their simplicity, in the quiet moments they shared. Life, though heavy with the weight of age and time, had felt complete with Milo by his side. But all that had changed. It started on the night of the storm, the night that seemed to carry with it a darkness far heavier than the clouds that rolled in across the hills. Elias had gone to bed, exhausted from the day's work, unaware that it would be the last night he would feel the warmth of his wife, Clara, beside him. Clara had been his companion long before Milo, his love, his strength. She had been the one to lift him up when the world seemed too heavy, the one to remind him of the beauty in every sunrise, the one who believed in the small joys that people often overlook. But that night, in the quiet stillness of their shared bed, she slipped away. Her breath slowed until it was no more, and her hand, once warm and full of life, had become cold beside his. Elias awoke in the morning to an empty room, the sun casting weak light through the curtains. But Clara was not there. His heart sank as he reached out for her, but there was no response, no soft murmur, no warmth. The world in an instant became unbearably quiet. His world had shattered, and it seemed there was no way to piece it together again. That morning he sat beside Clara's bed, his hands trembling as he tried to comprehend the impossible reality he now faced. The silence in the house was deafening, the emptiness overwhelming. Milo, sensing his distress, had climbed onto the bed and laid his head gently on Elias's lap, looking up at him with those deep, knowing eyes. For a moment it was as if the dog understood everything, understood the weight of the loss, the pain of grief. And in that moment Elias realized he wasn't alone. At least not completely, but that was before the barking began. At first it was quiet, a faint sound drifting in through the open window, a single bark, then another, and then an unsettling silence. It was as though Milo had felt the change in the air, had sensed something beyond what Elias could understand. But as the days passed, the barking grew louder. No longer just a passing noise in the distance, it became a constant, relentless sound echoing through the empty house, filling the dark corners that Elias could no longer bear to enter. It echoed through the night, the sound rising and falling, with the wind, yet it never seemed to stop. Elias had tried everything. He had called Milo in from the yard, coaxed him with treats, spoken to him softly, but nothing worked. Milo would bark as if something was calling him, as if he had to respond to a sound only he could hear. There was no peace in the house, anymore. The dog's voice seemed to fill the very air, making everything feel heavier, harder to bear. It wasn't just the barking itself. It was the way it pierced through the night, growing louder with every passing hour. It was as if Milo knew something Elias didn't, as if he was trying to tell Elias something he couldn't quite understand. It was the same every night. The darkness would fall, and with it, the barking would begin, unwavering and relentless. Times Elias would find himself pacing the cottage, his heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and frustration. He would go to the window and gaze out into the yard, but all he could see was the silhouette of Milo standing by the edge of the field, his head raised, his mouth open, calling to something or someone unseen. What was wrong with the dog? Why would he not stop? It was as though the death of Clara had left a hole not only in Elias's heart, but in the world itself. And somehow, Milo's incessant barking seemed to mirror the emptiness, the unspoken grief, that Elias could no longer escape. Each night it felt as though the dog's cries were calling for help, for something or someone that Elias could not reach. One evening, after hours of listening to the relentless barking, Elias finally reached his breaking point. His hands trembled as he stood by the door, the weight of his grief pressing down on him like a physical force. He had been awake for what felt like an eternity, his mind spiraling in circles of despair, and the constant barking was pushing him beyond his limits. He grasped the cold door handle, feeling the familiar roughness of the wood under his fingers. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the trees, making the shadows outside the cottage seem to stretch like dark fingers reaching for him. The moonlight was dim, barely able to cut through the thick fog that had rolled in from the hills. Yet despite the chill in the air, Elias felt a sudden surge of something, a mixture of fear, frustration, and the need to understand. The door creaked open, and he stepped out into the yard, the chill of the night biting at his skin. The barking, as if hearing his movements, grew louder, more urgent, but there was no sign of Milo in the yard. The dog was gone. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, his eyes scanning the dark expanse of the garden, but the dog was nowhere to be found. The barking continued, as persistent as ever, echoing from somewhere deep in the hills. It was as if Milo had been calling to him, begging for Elias to follow, to understand. And without a second thought, Elias knew that he had no choice. He had to go after him. But where was Milo? And why had he gone so far? Elias's heart ached as he took his first step down the uneven stone path. The dog was out there somewhere, and he would find him. The wind had picked up in the night, howling through the trees and sending the mist swirling in erratic patterns across the fields. Elias stood at the threshold of his yard, staring out into the vast expanse of the hills. The moon hung high above, casting long shadows across the uneven terrain. It felt like the world had been holding its breath, waiting for him to make a decision, to follow the sound of Milo's bark, which had not ceased. Elias's legs trembled beneath him, the cold of the night creeping up his bones. He had never ventured so far into the hills in the past few years, not since he and Clara had made their home in the valley. The thought of going beyond the familiar path was unsettling, as though crossing into a place where time and memory lost all meaning. But there was no turning back now. Not with Milo out there. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a hesitant step forward. The familiar yard, with its flower beds that Clara had once so carefully tended, felt distant now, foreign. Elias had lived here for decades, but tonight, the house seemed to whisper of something else, something beyond the everyday routines. It was as though the walls had become walls of sorrow, enclosing him with memories he could neither escape nor forget. The stone path, cracked and uneven, led him toward the hills, to the sound of Milo's urgent barking. Elias didn't know what had happened to Milo, what had driven the dog to bark so endlessly, so desperately. But there was one thing Elias knew, for certain. Milo wasn't just barking at nothing. There was something out there, something calling to the dog, something pulling him deeper into the hills. As he walked through the overgrown path that led toward the hills, the sound of Milo's barking continued to echo in the distance. It was louder now, reverberating through the night air in a way that made Elias's stomach tighten with dread. The bark was frantic, almost as if it was saying something, a warning, a plea, or maybe an invitation. Either way, the desperation in it made Elias's chest tighten. He tried to push the fear aside, focusing instead on the only thing that mattered, finding Milo. The path through the hills was uneven, the rocks slick from a light drizzle that had passed through earlier. Trees loomed over him like sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as if trying to trap him in the darkness. The higher Elias climbed, the harder it became to keep his footing, but the sound of Milo's barking kept him going, urging him forward, pulling him deeper into the forest. Minutes stretched into hours, though Elias could not say for certain how long he had been walking. His thoughts were clouded, his only focus on the sound of Milo. Each bark grew more urgent, more demanding. It seemed as though the dog was pleading with him, not just calling for him, but needing him. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin out, and Elias emerged into a clearing. The moon, now fully risen, bathed the land in a pale, eerie light. And there, just ahead, was something Elias had never noticed before. A dark mouth in the earth, a gaping cave hidden among the boulders. It was deep and black, as if the earth itself had swallowed the sky. The sound of Milo's barking was unmistakable now. It was coming from the cave. Elias's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the cave. The darkness within seemed to pulse, alive with something he couldn't see or understand. He stood there at the edge of the clearing, staring into the abyss of the cave, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The wind had died down, leaving behind an oppressive silence that pressed against his chest. "Milo," Elias whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Milo, is that you?" The dog's barking stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence. The air seemed to thicken, the shadows around the cave twisting in strange shapes. Elias could feel a chill creeping up his spine as the quiet stretched on, heavy and suffocating. He took a step closer to the mouth of the cave, squinting into the blackness. And then, from deep within the darkness, came the sound again. A single bark, followed by another, more forceful this time. The barks reverberated off the cave walls, echoing back at him, carrying a sense of urgency that made Elias's chest tighten. Without thinking, he took a step forward, then another. The sound of his own heartbeat seemed deafening in the quiet night air as he approached the cave. His feet were unsteady beneath him, the path uneven and rocky, but the desire to reach his dog, his faithful companion, pushed him onward. The closer Elias got to the entrance, the more the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. It was as though the world around him had stilled, waiting, watching. A strange force seemed to tug at him, drawing him closer to the cave. "Milo!" Elias called again, his voice trembling. There was no response, just the soft rustling of wind through the trees and the distant rhythmic sound of water dripping from the cave's jagged roof. Elias reached out to steady himself, his hand brushing against the rough stone of the cave's entrance. The cold seeped into his skin and he shivered involuntarily. The barking began again, louder, sharper now. Milo's voice sounded so close, yet Elias still could not see the dog. It was as if the cave itself had swallowed him whole. With his heart racing, Elias stepped into the darkness, the beam of moonlight fading as he passed into the shadow. His senses screamed at him to stop, to turn back, but he ignored them. The sound of Milo's barking grew louder with each step he took, pushing him deeper into the cave. The air grew thicker, heavier, as Elias ventured further in, his breath coming faster, more shallow. The walls of the cave seemed to close in around him, the rocky surface sharp against his fingertips as he navigated through the narrow passage. His footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing back to him in distorted whispers. And then, just when he thought he could go no further, the cave opened up. A small, dimly lit chamber stretched out before him. The air in here was still, almost suffocatingly so. The only sound was the soft dripping of water from the high ceiling and, just beyond, the sound of Milo's bark. More distant now, but still unmistakable. It came from deeper within the chamber, where the shadows were, thick and the light failed to reach. "Milo," Elias called again, his voice a hoarse rasp as he scanned the space around him. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw movement. A flicker of brown fur, perhaps. He was so close now. But what had drawn Milo here? What was it about this cave that had compelled the dog to come all this way? And why had he stopped barking when Elias arrived? A sense of foreboding gripped Elias as he stepped further into the cave, toward the sound of Milo's calls. The shadows in the corners of the chamber seemed to shift, and the hairs on the back of Elias's neck stood on end. The dog's voice, once clear and desperate, was now a low growl, like an animal caught in the grip of something far worse than fear. And with that growl, Elias realized that there was something more in this cave than just Milo. Something else waited for him in the dark, something he could not yet understand. Elias stood at the edge of the darkened chamber, his heart hammering, in his chest his breath shallow. The air was thick with moisture, the heavy scent of earth and stone filling his nostrils as he took one cautious step forward, then another. Each movement seemed to echo through the cavern, reverberating against the walls as if the cave itself were listening to him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The low, guttural growl that had replaced Milo's frantic barking reverberated in the silence, a sound that seemed so out of place in the cave's otherwise still air. It was the kind of growl that sent a chill racing up Elias's spine, one that had a strange otherworldly quality to it. It was deeper, more primal than the usual sounds Milo made. Something wild, something untamed, something Elias had never heard from his dog before. "Milo?" Elias's voice trembled as he called out into the darkness. The name felt foreign on his tongue, as if calling for a ghost rather than a living creature. There was no response, only the echo of his own voice bouncing back at him from all directions. The hairs on the back of Elias's neck stood on end. He couldn't shake the feeling that the cave was alive, that it had a presence, a pulse, a heartbeat. The sound of dripping water seemed to mimic the thrum of his own pulse, steady and rhythmic, creating a strange harmony between his own fear and the unknown forces surrounding him. For a brief moment, Elias hesitated, doubt gnawing at him. Was it really Milo inside the cave? Was the dog still the same? Or had something changed? Had the darkness of this place seeped into his companion, altering him in ways Elias could not comprehend? The growl came again, and this time it was followed by a sharp bark. It was unmistakable, the sound of Milo, but it was different. There was a rasp to it now, a tone of aggression that sent a shudder through Elias's bones. With his heart racing, Elias pressed on, his footsteps quickening as he moved deeper into the chamber. The growls continued, but now they were more frequent, more desperate, as if Milo was trapped or worse, in pain. He rounded a bend in the cave's winding passage, the path narrowing with each step. The light from the moon no longer reached this, far into the cave, leaving him in a suffocating blanket of shadow. The only illumination now came from the faint glow of phosphorescent minerals embedded in the walls, casting an eerie greenish light that only deepened the sense of unease gnawing at Elias's stomach. Finally, he reached a small open space in the heart of the cave. The sound of Milo's growl was louder now, but the dog wasn't in sight. Instead, there was something else, a strange, dark mass, half hidden in the shadows, just beyond the faint light. It looked like a pile of rocks, but it was too orderly, too structured to be natural. It seemed to shift and undulate, as if alive. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He felt the temperature of the cave drop even further, the cold seeping into his skin, numbing his hands and face. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped forward closer to the mass. And then suddenly Milo's bark rang out again, a sharp, pained cry that echoed off the walls, making Elias's pulse spike with panic. "Milo!" Elias shouted, his voice breaking as he stepped forward with a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. The sound of scraping and shifting stone filled the air, and Elias froze in place, his blood running cold. From the mass of rocks, something moved. It was slow at first, then faster, as if something was pushing its way out from the inside. The growl intensified, growing more guttural, more feral. Elias could feel it in his bones, the presence that had been lurking in the shadows, watching him. Something was there, something that had been waiting for him to come closer. Elias's hand instinctively reached out, brushing against the jagged stone wall as he stepped back, his mind racing for a solution, a way to make sense of what he was witnessing. But before he could make sense of it, a dark shape leapt out from the shadows, and the world around him seemed to shift violently. The thing that emerged from the shadows was no longer just Milo. It was the dog, yes, but it was different. The shaggy coat was matted with something dark, something that resembled blood, and his eyes were wide with an unnatural gleam, frenzied, wild, almost inhuman. Milo's usual soft brown eyes had become two burning orbs filled with something Elias couldn't name. The dog's body trembled, his muscles coiled with tension. His fur spiked like a wild animal caught in the grip of fear. Milo's bark was not one of joy or excitement. It was one of warning, of terror. The sound was strangled, barely more than a rasp, and the growls that followed it filled the air with an oppressive weight. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the dog, his beloved dog, back away. His body tensed as though he were trying to flee from something. From someone. Elias could barely breathe as he stepped closer, his mind swirling with questions. What had happened to Milo? Why was he acting like this? What was it that had changed him so completely? And then, Elias saw it. From the depths of the shadows beyond Milo, a shape stirred, a shadow larger than the dog, a presence that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. It was coming for them, and Elias knew, without a doubt, that whatever it was the thing that had been calling to Milo, the thing that had drawn him into the cave. It was the source of the growls, the source of the terror, the thing that had twisted the dog into something unrecognizable. Milo snapped his head toward the advancing shadow, his eyes wide with fear, but he didn't run. Instead, he let out a final, desperate cry, a bark that seemed to echo in the very bones of the cave, reverberating in the walls and in the soul of Elias. And then, as though in slow motion, the shape moved, faster than anything Elias could comprehend, its form coiling toward them with unnatural speed. Elias stumbled backward, his heart racing as the shadow advanced. He could feel the pull of something ancient, something dark drawing him in. His eyes were wide with disbelief, his body frozen in fear. "Milo!" he cried again, his voice cracking. But the dog didn't move. Instead, he stood still, his body trembling as if he were waiting for something, or someone. And then, with a sudden, heart-stopping realization, Elias understood. It wasn't just Milo who was trapped in this cave. It was both of them. The darkness was closing in, and it would consume them both unless Elias made a choice he had no idea how to make. The cave, now filled with the sound of racing footsteps and the relentless growls, had become a tomb not just for Milo but for him as well. And just as the shadow lunged forward, Elias understood that there was no escaping it. The world around Elias seemed to collapse into a blur of motion, the shadow hurtling toward him with the speed and intensity of a storm. His heart raced in his chest, each beat louder than the last. Time slowed, stretching out each moment into eternity. The growls from Milo were no longer desperate but primal, raw, echoes of something beyond fear. The dark mass, undulating and impossibly large, loomed in front of him, its shape barely discernible, in the half-light of the cave. It felt like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting, watching. The air had grown thick and cold, pressing against Elias's lungs as if the darkness wanted to suffocate him. Milo stood between Elias and the advancing shadow, his body shaking with fear. The dog's fur bristled, his eyes wide with terror and recognition, but he didn't move. He didn't flee. It was as though the dog had become a silent sentinel, caught between his loyalty to Elias and whatever force this cave had unleashed. "Milo," Elias shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of his fear. He took a step forward, heart pounding in his ears. The dog's form remained frozen, his tail tucked tightly against his body. the growls growing louder, more intense. It wasn't just a warning now. It was a cry for help. Elias reached out instinctively, his hand shaking as it hovered in the air between him and the dog. But before he could touch Milo, the shadow lunged with a ferocity that left him breathless. The cave seemed to grow even darker as the thing, a mass of shifting blackness, its form not fully tangible, swarmed toward them. The growls morphed into a screech, a guttural sound that rattled Elias's bones and made the hairs on his neck stand on end. It felt as though every inch of the cave was alive with this force, as if the walls themselves were screaming, pulsing, with an ancient hunger. For a moment, Elias thought he might lose his footing as the ground seemed to tremble beneath him, but he held his ground, clenching his fists. Then, out of the darkness, a voice, quiet, almost a whisper, reached his ears. "You shouldn't have come." Elias froze. His breath caught in his throat. The voice was not his own, nor was it Milo's. It wasn't human. The shadow seemed to pause as if acknowledging the words, and then the form in front of him began to take shape. A pair of glowing eyes appeared first, piercing through the darkness like twin stars. Their glow dim but sharp, unnatural. The rest of the shape slowly became discernible. A towering figure, an ancient presence, its outline shifting and rippling as if it were made of smoke or shadow itself. It stood unnaturally still, the air around it warping and bending as though reality itself was afraid of touching it. And then a laugh rippled through the cave. It was deep and hollow, reverberating off the stone walls, sending a shiver through Elias's entire being. "You think this is an accident?" The voice echoed again, sharp like a blade, its timbre rich with mockery. "This dog, this creature, he was never yours to begin with." Elias staggered backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The weight of those words, so impossibly cruel, pressed down on him like a 1,000-ton stone. He didn't understand. What was this thing? What was it talking about? "Milo," Elias whispered, his voice barely a breath. "What is this?" The figure before him flickered, the eyes flashing brighter for a moment, and then, slowly, as if savoring the confusion it caused, it spoke again. "You think you were the first to call to him? To think you could hold him, tame him, bind him to your miserable world?" Elias's stomach churned, nausea rising in his throat. The words felt like a slap, but they made no sense. Milo had been his companion, his friend, had been his only family for years. He had raised the dog, loved him, cared for him. There was no way this thing could be telling the truth. But as he looked down at Milo, Elias saw something different in the dog's eyes. There was no recognition there, no warmth. Only fear, wild and untamed, as if Milo were struggling against some invisible force, a force far stronger than anything Elias could comprehend. Elias reached out again, his voice desperate. "Milo! Please, please!" His hand shook as he tried to approach the dog. But Milo stayed back as if bound by an invisible leash. The shadow figure let out a low, rumbling chuckle, its voice sending another tremor through the air. "You cannot save him, old man." Elias's heart broke as the words sank in, each syllable another crack in his resolve. The dark figure stepped closer, its form now fully materialized before him. It was no longer just a cloud of shadow. It was something more, something ancient. The being's face, or what could be called a face, was devoid of any recognizable features, save for those eyes, those burning, inhuman eyes. It was neither human nor beast. It was something far older, far more terrifying than anything Elias had ever imagined. "This is where he belongs," the figure whispered, its voice turning cold. "This is his true nature. You were never meant to tame him. Never meant to keep him. The mountains call to him, the caves call to him." Elias could feel the weight of those words like a physical blow. He didn't want to hear them, didn't want to understand them, but they were impossible to ignore. "Milo, no," Elias choked, reaching for the dog, his voice cracking as he called out one last time. I won't leave you here." But Milo did not move. He was not the same dog anymore. He was no longer the playful, gentle creature Elias had known. In that moment, Elias realized the truth. Milo had never been just a dog. He was something else entirely, something tied to this cave, to the ancient force that now stood before them. The cave had called to him, and it had claimed him. He had been chosen, long before Elias had ever come into his life. The shadow figure stepped forward again, its presence now all-encompassing. Elias felt the weight of its stare, the crushing heaviness of its power. The dog's distant, fearful eyes locked with his for a moment, and in them Elias saw a flicker of recognition, just for an instant. And then, the dog's body went rigid. The growls stopped. Milo turned, his steps slow and deliberate, as if obeying an invisible command. His eyes remained fixed on Elias, but there was no love in them anymore, only a hollow, distant emptiness. As the dog walked away deeper into the cave, Elias felt something break within him. His heart fractured as the realization set in. Milo was lost to him, swallowed by this ancient darkness. The bond they had shared, the love that had once been so pure and strong, was no longer enough to save him. Let him go. The shadow's voice was soft, almost soothing now. It is his destiny. His place is here, with us. Elias felt his knees weaken, the pain of the loss overwhelming him. There was nothing left to hold on to, nothing left but the cruel emptiness of the cave, of this terrible force that had torn his world apart. Milo's form vanished into the darkness, and Elias was left standing alone, surrounded by an ancient void, with nothing but the echo of his own heartache. The darkness around him closed in, and for the first time, Elias realized that some things could never be brought back. Some things, once lost, were gone forever. The darkness pressed in on Elias like a suffocating blanket, each breath he took feeling heavier than the last. He stood frozen in the cavern, his eyes still searching the shadows where Milo had vanished, though he knew deep down that the dog was lost to him forever. The last of the desperate barks, the guttural growls, the pleas of a creature caught between two worlds, those sounds had faded into an eerie silence that filled the cave, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. Elias's chest ached. It wasn't just from the cold that had seeped into his bones or the physical weariness from the climb. No, it was the weight of loss, a deep, crushing sorrow that had no name. His heart felt like it had shattered, each piece slipping away into the vast nothingness of the cave, carried away by the same shadow that had stolen Milo. He sank to his knees in the darkness, his hands trembling as they pressed against the cold stone beneath him. His body trembled with the shock of what had happened, his mind struggling to comprehend it. "Milo," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible, swallowed by the depths of the cavern. I should have known." There was no response, no comforting nudge, no wagging tail to greet him. Just the stillness, the haunting silence that stretched out forever. He wanted to scream, to shout into the void, to demand answers from the shadow that had taken his dog. But the words stuck in his throat. What was left to say? What could he say to the darkness that had claimed everything? Elias had failed. For the first time in his life, he realized that no amount of love, no amount of care or devotion could have prevented this. There had been forces at work far beyond his understanding, ancient forces tied to the land, to the hills, to the very bones of the earth. And they had claimed Milo as they had claimed so many before. He hadn't been able to save him. The thought lingered in his mind, its weight crushing. He had spent so many years of his life loving and caring for Milo, never considering that he might lose him. But now, with the truth laid bare, Elias understood that the dog had never truly belonged to him. Milo had been a creature of the wild, a part of something far older, far more powerful. And now, that connection had claimed him. For a long time, Elias knelt there, his head bowed, his breath ragged as the pain of it all tore through him. He thought of the quiet nights in the cottage, the long walks through the hills, The way Milo had always been there, a constant presence by his side. He had been more than just a dog. He had been Elias's family, his companion, his confidant, his reason to smile when the world felt cold and alone. Now that world felt utterly empty. Elias slowly lifted his head and glanced around the cavern, the faint glow of the phosphorescent stones casting an otherworldly light on the jagged walls. The shadow that had spoken to him still lingered, though it had faded somewhat. It wasn't gone entirely, but its presence had lessened as though it were watching him, waiting for him to come to terms with the loss. He was never yours to keep. The voice came again, soft but final, as if the shadow were offering its last word on the matter. Elias closed his eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. He wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice of it all, but the hollow silence of the cave stilled his voice. The truth, no matter how cruel, had been spoken. The shadow's presence loomed closer now, filling the air with an oppressive force, and Elias knew that he had no more strength to fight it. Whatever had brought him here, whatever had drawn him into this darkness, was beyond him. He had no power here, no agency. He was a small part of a much larger, far older cycle, a cycle that had long been in motion. The shadow moved, its form swirling around Elias like smoke, and for a fleeting moment, Elias thought he saw something that flickered deep within its essence. A memory, perhaps. A vision. It was a memory of another man, long ago, standing in a similar cave, calling out to a companion who had been claimed by the dark. A man much like Elias, desperate and broken by the loss of someone he loved. But in that man's eyes there was a knowledge that Elias had yet to understand, a painful wisdom that came from accepting the darkness, from letting go of what was no longer his. "This is the way of things," the shadow whispered. "The cave claims. The hills claim. The earth itself claims what it is owed. You were a part of his journey, yes. But his path was always his own." Elias felt his breath catch in his throat, the coldness of the cave seeping into his very soul. The realization was unbearable, but it was the truth. Milo had come to him, yes, but the dog had always been destined for something far greater, far darker than anything Elias had imagined. "He is where he belongs now," the shadow murmured. "And so are you." The weight of those words settled into Elias's chest, and for a moment he thought he might break under the pressure. But then, as the silence stretched on, something shifted inside of him. A quiet understanding began to unfurl in the back of his mind. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. He had loved Milo, truly and deeply. That love had been pure, without condition, and perhaps, Elias thought, that was enough. That was all that he could give. His love had been a part of Milo's journey, and in some way he would always carry that love with him. The shadows began to dissipate, their presence fading like the last light of day, and in their place, there was a strange stillness, a peace, or perhaps a resignation. Elias didn't know what would come next, but for the first time since stepping into the cave, he didn't feel entirely lost. There was a strange sense of finality, but also a quiet, almost imperceptible flicker of something else. Something that felt like release. The cave, it seemed, had given him what it had taken. It had shown him the truth. It had shown him the price of love, the price of devotion, and the price of letting go. Milo was gone, but he would remain with Elias in memory, in heart, in the echo of those years they had shared. The dog had been Elias's family, and nothing could ever take that away from him. Elias stood slowly, his knees aching from the long hours spent kneeling on the cold stone. He wiped his eyes, though no tears had come. His body was exhausted, but his mind felt strangely lighter, as though the weight of his grief had been shared by the cavern itself. He turned and began to walk toward the cave's entrance, the echo of his footsteps the only sound in the vast emptiness. The air was no longer suffocating. It felt different somehow, as if the cave had given up its grip on him, allowing him to leave, to walk away. Outside, The moon still hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the hills. The wind had picked up again, rustling through the trees as if nothing had changed. But Elias knew that everything had changed. Milo was gone, but the love they had shared would endure. It was enough. And perhaps in time, he would find peace with that. As Elias made his way down the rocky path, the sound of his footsteps mingled with the wind and the rustling of leaves. The hills of Mornhill stretched out before him, vast and endless, but Elias didn't feel small anymore. He felt connected. Connected to the land, to the journey, and to the memory of the dog who had once been his only family. And somewhere, deep within the earth, he imagined that Milo too had found peace, and that thought, however small, was enough. As we reach the end of this journey, one filled with loss, love, and the haunting pull of fate, we ask you, the audience, to reflect on the deepest questions this story has brought to light. What would you do when everything you love slips? Beyond your reach? How far would you go to hold on to something that was never truly yours to keep? Now, as the final chapter of Elias's heartache and growth unfolds, we invite you to take the next step in this emotional journey. The auction is now open for your bids, your thoughts, your interpretations, your connection to the characters, their choices, and the price of love.